I am continuing in my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am continuing reading in a chronological order, according to event, not according to publication or volume, so I'm skipping around a bit as I move along. We are continuing in our reading in the Gospels. We are near the end of Holy Week. Christ is now arrested, tried before the priests, tried before Pilate, all that good stuff. Our last reading was in Matthew, the actual crucifixion, death, and burial of Christ. We are now going to read the Joseph Smith translation of this portion of Matthew. So this will be the Joseph Smith translation of Matthew chapter 27, verses 27 to 57, although skipping over verses 52 and 53 again. In verse 27, at the end there, and gathered together unto him the whole band, so no longer of soldiers, because we already know it's the soldiers. In verse 28, it is no longer a scarlet robe, it is corrected to a purple robe, purple being the color of royalty. At this time, purple was a very hard color to create a dye for, and so it was reserved for the very highest classes of society. It was the color of royalty. In verse 29, near the end, instead of and mocked him, it's and they mocked him. Verse 33, instead of a place of a skull, it is a place of burial. So Golgotha, this was a place where you would have had tombs for burying the dead. In verse 34, instead of and when he had tasted thereof, it is and when he tasted the vinegar. So it's not that he didn't want to drink, it's that he didn't want specifically to drink vinegar. Because as I said, it dulled the senses, is what it would have done. In verse 35, at the end there, and for my vesture they did cast lots. Minor grammatical corrections, although I forgot to mention it, but I believe this is from Isaiah. I can't remember exactly where, but the parting my garments among them and casting lots. And the reason they cast lots, to part the garment was, a garment would have been sewn together in pieces, and they would have just divided it on the seams and separated, they each got an equal part of it. But on the vesture or on the robe, it was a single piece. There were no seams. It was woven. And so they cast lots, or man with the longest straw got to get the robe because they didn't want to rip it up. But we move on now, verse 37. This is very much rewritten, so we read the whole thing. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And the chief priest said unto Pilate, it should be written and set up over his head his accusation. This is he that said he was Jesus, King of the Jews. But Pilate answered and said, what I have written, let it alone. So I love this one, and I believe this is in Mark, possibly Luke. But I like this. Pilate, as it was normal, when you crucify somebody, you'd have a plaque at the top of the cross that declared what crime they committed for which they were being crucified. And Pilate, he writes out the accusation, this is Jesus, King of the Jews, and the priests get upset. So no, the accusation isn't that he is the King of the Jews, but that he claimed to be the King of the Jews. He committed blasphemy making this claim. And Pilate said, no, he is the King of the Jews. He is exactly who he said he was, and you're going to leave that alone. I'm letting the world know that the only reason you're killing this man is because you are envious of it. In doing this, Pilate is declaring not Christ's crime, but he is publicly declaring the priest's crime. And I love that. We continue, verse 40. We have this in we continue, verse 40. We have this near the middle there. And buildest it in 3 days is now, and buildest it again in 3 days. In verse 41, it is, instead of mocking him, it is just mocking. Verse 43 now reads, he trusted in God, let him deliver him, if he will save him. Let him save him, for he said, I am the Son of God. That's interesting there. Not real substantive and a change in meaning, but I like the wording. But now we have this very much different thing in 44. We'll read this whole verse. One of the thieves also, which was crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. But the other rebuked him, saying, dost thou not fear God, seeing thou art under the same condemnation? And this man is just, and hath not sinned. And he cried unto the Lord that he would save him. And the Lord said unto him, this day thou shalt be with me in paradise. Now this makes it agree with Luke. Luke's the one that is famous for having the story of the thieves. The Joseph Smith translation tells us that Matthew recorded the same story. Now in verse 47, that is changed to him. When they heard that is when they heard him. In verse 49, instead of just let be, it is let him be. In verse 50, we now have Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, saying, Father, it is finished, thy will is done, yielded up the ghost. So we're given here what he said, which I believe is recorded in other Gospels, but it's nice that Matthew also records it. Then we go down to 54, now reads, And when the centurions and they that were with him, watching Jesus, heard the earthquake, and saw those things which were done, they feared greatly. Minor grammatical corrections, although I'm not sure why we're pluralizing centurion. In verse 55, we now have at the end, ministering unto him for his burial. So the women were ministering unto him for his burial. That's an interesting one. Remember, Mary anointed him with the spikenard, and Christ said, this is in preparation of my death. That's interesting. In verse 56, which is now whom? In verse 57, instead of when the even, it is when the evening was come. In verse 64, at the end there, instead of so the last error shall be worse than the first, we have so this last impostor will be worse than the first. And then in 65, instead of make it as sure as ye can, it is as you can. Let's step back there to 64. This last impostor will be worse than the first. What they're saying here is that they're calling Christ an impostor. He's a fraud. He's making stuff up. And if you allow them to steal his body off, then their fraud will be greater than Christ's fraud. But again, not exactly new information, a good clarification of the meaning, but not really new meaning, no new information. So we're going to leave it here, and we will read the story of the crucifixion and burial in Mark next, so I will see you there.